bringing a new level attention to runoff and several other troubles in the Great Lakes.
I think the problem in Toronto is that we are a city on the water that doesn't act like it. There's such a disconnect between people living in the city and engaging with the water.
We will be continuing until we have to have the situation resolved. This is not something where we're focused on the cost, where we're focused on the solution and getting the best service that we can to get the beaches back and get the island safe again.
So yeah, I think it can be done. It's just it's a daunting task, and I think that's why no one's done it. It's because it is such a complex issue.
Growing up in Toronto, like millions of people, I was barely aware of the lake that we live beside. I would occasionally catch a glimpse of its blue expanse while driving on the highway or while sailing in the harbor. During summers, my family would migrate to Nova Scotia for a month and a half, where I began to play in the waves of the Atlantic Ocean. My first full-length wetsuit allowed me to spend hours learning how to bodyboard and eventually surf at the age of 7. Returning to Toronto for school in September caused my entire family to mourn the loss of our favorite activity. We would eagerly count down the months until our return to the coast. One day my father said he heard that you could surf on the Great Lakes, and this seemed improbable. But during a September gale in 2016, we drove down to the Scarborough Bluffs and saw, to our amazement, fellow surfers changing in the parking lot, rushing towards the lake with their surfboards. Is this for real, we thought? Sure enough, there were waves to be ridden and many new friends to make. And yet, it took another year for me to get desperate enough to pull on a 5'4" hooded wetsuit and brave the icy waters of the lakes during the winter and early spring when the waves can be the best. I was now hooked on surfing the lakes and began studying the weather maps and forecasts in order to catch the brief period that the waves are surfable on the Great Lakes. I came to appreciate the shoreline of Western Lake Ontario in a whole new way through surfing. With other surfers, I would find myself enjoying our sport, sometimes surrounded by natural beauty, but more often surrounded by the ugly impact of human development. However, in some locations, I experienced development that harmonized with nature to a certain degree, and even cases where nature was returning. All of this got me to thinking about the old nature versus nurture question. Does it need to be either or? Perhaps there is a way that we can take better care of the precious resource that the lakes represent so that their beauty is not destroyed by human development.
One of the main problems though is always related to money and funding, and I think that we could always get more money from the government to better take care of the lake.
Federal Environmental Protection Agency announced that it will provide $12 million to the region to help address those problems.
Early this spring, I decided to go on a road trip to pursue the question of whether it is possible to take better care of Lake Ontario. The first location I visited was the Scarborough Bluffs, a beautiful and scenic place. The natural splendor of the bluffs was admired by the first Europeans to explore the west end of Lake Ontario. However, human development has accelerated the erosion of the bluffs through trees being cleared for farming, cottages being built, suburban homes being built, and removal of stones and gravel from the base. The conservation agency had to come up with a plan to slow the erosion, and they did so by building breakwaters and ponds, which also created habitat for birds. I've spent countless hours at the bluffs because of the fun waves it provides on a strong east. It is a rare location where both human development and nature have found somewhat of a balance. Lurking around the corner from the Scarborough Bluffs, there is the Darlington Nuclear Power Plant, which provides power for millions of people, but it also has the potential to poison the entire lake in the event of a nuclear malfunction. To the west of the Scarborough Bluffs is the historic R.C. Harris Water Treatment Plant that was built in the 1930s that has tunnels underneath the lake to bring in clean, fresh drinking water to the thirsty city of Toronto. And just a bit further west is the infamous Ashbridges Bay Sewage Treatment Plant. When I asked my interviewees how we can take better care of Lake Ontario, the majority of them responded that we must get the community and city involved with the lake, whether it's through recreation or awareness.
People don't engage with the water, they don't manage the water correctly, and I think they're afraid of the water. Unfortunately, the Great Lakes and Lake Ontario specifically has a bad reputation. So people are too afraid to go swimming, they're too afraid to be in the water and be around it. So then when that's the case, then you're not thinking about how you can take care of it too.
To improve the condition of Lake Ontario and just all the Great Lakes really is going to come down to stewardship and getting more people involved and out on the water. The more people are on it, the more ownership they'll take towards the water, and the more that you'll get the people and communities involved in issues of industry, of pollution, of even just doing small action community projects like beach cleanups, awareness and stuff like that. So I think really it stems down to getting more people out on the lake, educating people, and starting from that sort of grassroots community base.
The first thing would be to try and make everyone aware of how important this is to us, but also you have to tell people from young up, it has to be part of your daily life or natural habit or instinct to care for your water system, whether that's picking up garbage, but it really starts with how you live your own life, what you flush down your drain, what you consume, what you buy.
I also think that it's really important to get the communities more involved. I personally believe in more community-oriented approach to certain problems, especially related to water pollution.
There's so many places in North America that are short of water and need water. The Great Lakes is the largest source of clean water on this continent, and we need to be very conscious of that in relationship to a huge and growing urban population around the Great Lakes and in the watersheds to the south particularly. Water demand is being challenged by a couple of things, and that is really number one is climate change. Obviously we can examine the situation that we're in and we can see the potential for water to be more difficult to get or in more volume than we actually know what to do with. So we're getting higher and higher rainfall events, but drier and hotter summers and drier and colder winters.
The Toronto Harbour is full of raw sewage. That's according to a damning report out by the environmental group Lake Ontario Waterkeeper. The group is claiming that there are 9 underwater pipes, including one here near the foot of Bathurst, that are overflowing into the harbour several times a week, creating dangerous conditions.
The second location I visited was the Ashbridges Bay Sewage Treatment Plant, known for its bad smell and poor location in proximity to neighborhoods and beaches. Until 1910, the City of Toronto dumped raw sewage straight into Lake Ontario, contaminating the beaches and depositing a meter-deep layer of sludge on the bottom of the harbour. Meanwhile, thousands of children were dying of infectious diseases linked to a typhoid outbreak due to poor sanitary conditions and unsafe drinking water. Today, the Ashbridges plant treats the wastewater produced by 1.4 million of the city's residents, and it has a capacity of 818,000 cubic meters per day. Until 1999, it was officially known as the main treatment plant for Toronto. And yet, when there are heavy rainfalls, the treatment plant is overwhelmed by the runoff and sewage is pumped directly into the lake. During May of last year's spring, 521 Olympic pools of sewage were dumped into Lake Ontario. Looking back, it creeps me out knowing that I was probably surfing during one of these bypasses. Surely this has to stop given that we are drinking from the lake water.
Because so many people require fresh, clean water, we have to be really protective of the ecosystem as we're still consuming more and more water and also discharging more and more wastewater. People need to recognize that the waste systems all have to be up to speed. They have to be properly designed and managed, and we can't be running effluents into the Great Lakes or fresh water anywhere that are going to accumulate rather than break down into normal ecological balance.
The third location I visited was the Toronto-Portland salt piles on Cherry Street, located right beside the Don River, which are stored for use on the city streets and sidewalks. The sheer size of the salt piles gave me an idea of the magnitude of the problem created by toxic substances running into our watershed. Many of the ocean-going ships that come up the Great Lakes bring invasive species in their ballast water that gets discharged into the Great Lakes.
Even the simple example we had this winter of the excessive amounts of salt being used on our streets, that salt was washing into the waterways at alarming rates to the point where the Don River measurements of salt was higher than you would find in the Atlantic Ocean at periods of time. And so those salt levels are not sustainable for freshwater species. And salt will bioaccumulate to some extent as those crystal salt structures that just end up in the water system. Until they break down, they're going to continuing dissolve and add salt to the water. So you're brining up a system that is normally very fresh.
En route west, I briefly visited the Don River mouth just next to the Cherry Street salt piles. For over 12,000 years, humans have lived on the Don River, but in the last 150 years we have managed to turn it into a toxic dump. During the early part of the 20th century, the river and valley continued to be neglected. 31 separate sewage treatment plants were built along the river, and over 20 locations in the valley and adjacent ravines were used as landfills for garbage and industrial refuse. Although there has been much done to clean up the river and fish are finally beginning to return to its waters, the mouth of the Don River is disgusting, particularly after rainfall.
I think right now some of the biggest problems are probably agricultural runoff going into the lakes and also plastics. 80% of pollutants in the Great Lakes especially are made up of plastics, and I think plastics is one of the big problems right now.
After driving for an hour, I arrived at 50 Point, that is just around the corner from Hamilton and is wedged between a military shooting range and a new housing development. Surfers have long enjoyed this spot on a northeast wind because of the appealing beach break it offers. At this spot, I feel most connected to nature as it must have existed before the heavy development on the western end of Lake Ontario. Yet on a clear day, one can see the high-rises of Toronto looming across the lake.
I have faith that people can turn around, but it's going to take a lot, and kind of like we said before, people don't do anything until it's like the last moment or it affects them. But I think it's a matter for everyone to contribute to a certain degree, and it's a bigger picture than just us or just you, but every person makes a difference.
Many of the rivers and streams that are not affected, say, by salt or urbanization are doing really well in the Great Lakes right now. There's so many wonderful freshwater creeks that are producing lots and lots of fish and are getting much cleaner than they were 25, 30 years ago, post-Second World War, where they had been pretty much ignored. That is, there's been a tremendous amount of improvement. Much better spawning beds are available again, much better covers over the creeks so that the shade of the trees is actually keeping the water cold. The water is much cleaner than it was because the agricultural runoff has been reduced and controlled. There isn't the same chemical emissions from agriculture there used to be. So a lot of that is much better. So I would say 50% of the ecosystem around the Great Lakes is, especially the part that's relatively natural and not urbanized, is very healthy and improving rather than decreasing.
Well, I'm from Mauritius, which is a small island, and the Great Lakes are the closest thing I have here to the ocean or something that looks like the ocean. So I find myself always attracted to them, and I want to try my best to be able to keep them clean and conserve them.
Just a few kilometers north of 50 Point, there is one of the most polluted waters in all of North America. Hamilton Harbor, once known as Burlington Bay, is an industrial, smoldering landscape. Constant infilling, particularly in the north end of Hamilton, damaged freshwater streams and the wildlife they support. Channel dredging has stirred up natural and unnatural sediments, further disrupting ecological land balance in the area. Chemical, industrial, and thermal pollution, especially as a byproduct of the growing steel industry after the 1890s, continued to degrade the environment. However, the waterways in Hamilton have not always been polluted. The north end of the harbor used to be a regular swimming spot for the working class families. But many families were overcome by the health hazards when dumping in sewage into the inlets and bay itself became a regular occurrence. As early as the 1860s, a fishery inspector at the Hamilton Harbor discovered that fish found along the shore tasted of coal oil and that dead ducks and muskrats were coated with oil from the two refineries. By the 1950s, city officials had deemed Hamilton Harbor unfit for any recreational use and shut down all the beaches.
There's a lot of pollution issues. Being out there as a water user with surfing, you see pollution, you can smell it. More people would start using the water if they didn't think it was so polluted.
I think it would be great if we could get more funding from the government. I think in general there's a lot of money invested in oil and gas, but I think they could actually try to invest more in water conservation. And in the past few years, the new government has done that a little bit more.
What do you think we can learn about taking better care of the lake from Indigenous people?
Unfortunately, it's hard to know how to interpret what we're going to learn because we have made so many changes and done so many things to the ecosystem that have shifted the balance. What they're going to stand firmly on, no matter what you do, is to say you have to listen to the lake, you have to learn about the lake from the lake. You have to know it like a brother and a sister, and you have to treat it with respect. And those are not easy for people who want to make a living and have economic wants and needs for more clean water in a shrinking water supply system. So it is a very tough message that we're going to be given, is that you can't be so disrespectful and not expect to pay a price. And you will never, ever recover if you continue to be abusing and not treating the system with all the honor and respect that it deserves.
Have to ask the question if we're treating something properly. What would you think? Like, obviously there's something lacking there, whether it's our own consciousness and being aware of it, and most of the time people don't really care about something unless it affects them.
I became more aware of the incredible resource Lake Ontario is through surfing. I think it is time we learn from the Indigenous people of the region who have lived on the shores of the Great Lakes for thousands of years without threatening to destroy them. As a native elder once said, when you respect water, the water will respect you back. If you don't respect water, that water will take you. That's when you drown. That is the first thing that any surfer, diver, or boater learns if they wish to remain safe on the water. If we don't make significant changes, we could be in danger of drowning in our own garbage.
Change a little bit of their life, just knowing what they consume and flush down their drain, because it all ends up seeping into the bigger ocean basin, and that we're all connected, I think, is really important. Key to remember, you're not just saving one body of water, you're inevitably saving the entire body of water, whether you start with fresh water or salt water.
They will only accept, in my view, clean, natural water being protected in every phase of its life, whether it's providing us with drinking water or water to dilute chemicals in a power plant, or whether it's to provide effluent to wash cars and other things. All that has to be done in such a way that it ends up going back to the natural ecosystem clean. If we can't accomplish that, then we are not showing respect for this large, beautiful body of water that has come, to us. We are the luckiest people to ever live beside it, and we are not respecting or honoring that. And that's what they would say is unacceptable.